Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Now, the unfolding crisis in Afghanistan has prompted Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari to warn about what he calls the new frontline of global militancy in Africa. You might have already heard about it. It's been out the last few days, but it's contained in an opinion piece Mr. Buhari wrote earlier in the week in the Financial Times newspaper in the UK. As Afghanistan falls, what then does this mean for the continent? President Buhari said that COVID-19 was part of the thing to blame because it's been like oxygen for terrorism, allowing it to gain in strength while the world was preoccupied. And now, with the Taliban's swift takeover in Afghanistan, Mr. Buhari is warning that the war on terror is not over, but is shifting to Africa. He said Africa needs more than US military assistance to defeat terrorism. It needs investment. But he lamented that Western allies, bruised as they are by their Middle East and Afghan experiences, were not prioritizing Africa. Well, Richard T. Hines is president and CEO of RTH Consulting, which specializes in domestic government procurement and international relations, particularly as it relates to Africa. He's also a Republican, and he joins me now from South Carolina. I believe you're in South Carolina, Richard?
I am. It's very warm. It's August. It's very warm here.
Well, hopefully it's a bit cooler.
Yeah,
it's a bit cool here, actually, to be fair.
Oh, really?
But
I'll be on my way. I'll be on my way to Abuja.
Let's sort of launch straight into it. I mean, you've seen that article written by President Buhari. What do you make of it?
I think it's an outstanding article. I would recommend it to all the policymakers in Washington. What Afghanistan means for America and for Africa, it's a colossal failure of what we've called for decades nation building. It's a failure. One picture of a helicopter lifting off the U.S. Embassy in Kabul showed the gay rights flag behind on the embassy. Well, this idea of homosexual stuff is completely alien to the culture in Afghanistan. And you can understand the fact that it actually fuels militancy. So you preach this gospel of feminism and gay rights, and it's not what they want in Afghanistan. And the result is disaster. We've got to get away from nation building. And if we want to combat terrorism, I think President Buhari has done an excellent job in distilling the fact that we need plowshares, not just swords. My only reservation about it would be to say we need both. In other words, in Somalia and Boko Haram in Nigeria, you've got to have swords, but you've also got to have plowshares. And the statistics he mentions in the article about the rapid population growth in Nigeria alone, the West must take heed that we will either hang together or we will hang separately. We've got to do something to create employment, to bring technology and infrastructure to Nigeria and other African countries. I would say this, though, so far as the point he makes about COVID being the oxygen of terrorism, Nigeria has a very good infrastructure on healthcare. And the experience with COVID has been very positive, much more positive than many Western countries. So Nigeria deserves a great deal of credit. Unfortunately, my country and the Biden administration does not deserve a great deal of credit about the way they've handled the collapse of the pro-Western regime in Afghanistan. You don't withdraw your troops before you withdraw your people. This is foolish. I mean, everybody can see that now. It's a source of major embarrassment, and we should not repeat this again. And that includes Iraq. This failure of nation building goes all the way back to Vietnam, and over again we see it failing.
Yes, I mean, there have been some links made to, or comparisons made to Saigon and so on.
Yes.
But that's another story. And you made a point about Nigeria's healthcare system and how robust it is. I think a lot of Nigerians would dispute that and say that the COVID thing is a matter of luck for Nigeria. Although, in fairness to the statement that you made, the Nigerians appear to be quite good at dealing with specific outbreaks of disease rather than having generally a robust healthcare system. But returning to the issue of Mr. Buhari and the statement he made, is there a sense that he takes from Afghanistan, when you apply it to places like, the Sahel or Somalia or even northern Nigeria, for instance, that it is important for Western countries to stay on to fight extremism, or perhaps that they shouldn't have been there in the first place? Or are the situations and the trajectory not the same in your assessment?
Well, it's a very good question, Charles. And my answer as a Republican would be we shouldn't be there in the first place. Now, I will admit to you the American intervention in Afghanistan began many years ago under President Reagan, and I served as an appointee under President Reagan. And at the time, we thought that was the right thing to do because the Cold War was still rolling. But it came back to bite us at 9/11. The same people we were giving weapons to fight the Russians with were the ones that formed Al Qaeda. It was a growth out of the Taliban. And we lived to regret what we had done during the Reagan administration on 9/11. And now we've seen yet another great failure of nation building. And so we should get out of that business and get into the business that President Buhari is talking about of helping Nigeria to build its infrastructure, perhaps become a model for the African continent. Nigeria is ahead of the rest of Africa in many, many ways. Healthcare being one of them. Technology. It's a very advanced country for technology. So we need to strengthen this infrastructure. And let's talk about money. The official figure of how much money we've spent in Afghanistan, meaning we Americans, 1.2 trillion. It's probably closer to 2 trillion. Well, I know domestically we could rebuild our interstate highway system as one of the largest countries in the world with that kind of money. We could revolutionize for 1.2 trillion the whole infrastructure of the African continent. So you see this massive waste of money and lives now in Afghanistan. The idea you want to take American culture and our toleration for feminism and gay rights and all, and take it to a fundamentalist country like Afghanistan, it's always going to fail. That money can be better spent in infrastructure.
Yes, I mean, you have a point there, Richard, but I mean, is it really a massive waste of money and time? I mean, there was a reason why the Americans went in there. The objective was to try and defeat terrorism, the terrorism that led to an attack in America, and they did that, didn't they?
Well, they did that. Of course, we thought originally that bin Laden was in Afghanistan. It ended up he was in Pakistan, being protected by the Pakistani military. So combating terrorism is a very difficult task, and it requires a rifle shot, not a shotgun approach. And we took a shotgun approach. We were going to remake Afghanistan in the model of America, and it didn't work. It didn't work in Vietnam. It's not going to work in Iraq. We need to let indigenous peoples make their own decisions to the extent that we can help those decisions by providing capital for infrastructure. I think President Buhari is right on point.
And you talked about that, of course, Mr. Buhari, obviously, presumably he's thinking of his own country, Nigeria, and Boko Haram and all the rest of it, is that he thinks that African countries need US military aid, but as you said, they need not swords but plowshares, or as you said, they need
Yes.
both. I mean, but in terms of that and the need to construct as well as to destroy terrorism, where do you come in? Because, I mean, you've done a lot of work in Africa, and I think you've done work in Nigeria as well. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it's interesting. Your last guest was from Cameroon originally. Perhaps he was born in Kenya. But if you look at, let's say, the Chinese, we haven't discussed the Chinese. The Chinese have done a lot of work in Africa. But, for example, I negotiated the Chadian end of the pipeline that runs from Chad into Cameroon and terminates at Karibi. The Chinese came in to build a new port at Karibi. It was commented to me by an official in the Cameroon government at the time that the Chinese were not as good as the old colonialists. They were the new colonialists. I said, why do you feel that way? And he said, because they use all Chinese labor. They don't use African labor. So these decisions about, well, you're going to take surplus population from China and put it into Africa, I question how valuable that is for Africa. I think we need to let the indigenous peoples in Cameroon, Nigeria, Somalia, they need to come up with their solutions. And the West, not just the United States, but the Western allies as a whole, should be active in supporting those ventures. And it will pay a great dividend because you create employment. Employment is very important. It's debatable how much good is done when you bring thousands and thousands of Chinese in to construct all the infrastructure. How does that help Nigerian employment? Well, it does not.
Let's not get too distracted with what the Chinese are doing, because I mean, although I take the point that you're making, but the main focus, of course, is on Afghanistan. Do you see greater similarities between the case in Nigeria and Afghanistan? Because I mean, Boko Haram is originally from Nigeria and is not a foreign movement, and therefore there are greater similarities between Boko Haram and the Taliban, for instance.
Well, I would take issue with that, and I wouldn't agree with the statement you just made. I think the militant Islamic terrorists are antithetical to Nigerian culture, to African culture as a whole. Africa this is an alien way, an alien philosophy. The Nigerian way is not fanaticism and terrorism. That is antithetical to Nigerian culture, in my opinion. I'm not a Nigerian, but I've been to Nigeria many times, and I love Nigeria. But it's very antithetical, the idea of bringing in a philosophy like Boko Haram. I think the idea of Boko Haram was very similar to the idea of militant communism in the old days. And militant communism was also, the philosophy was an importation. So the philosophy of Boko Haram is not Nigerian, it's an imported philosophy, and it's alien to Nigerian culture. That's my opinion.
Well, that's a very interesting opinion, and I suspect that a lot of people would agree with your assessments there. But, I mean, it's always brilliant talking with you, Richard. I mean, you've got such a wide sort of berth of experience, and I expect people who are watching would probably agree with me. So the reason I'm saying that is that I want to talk with you some more. So stay with us. Don't go anywhere. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about lessons for Africa's war and terror from the debacle in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Onyegolu. Now we're trying to unpick the nettlesome issue of Afghanistan and to figure out what lessons can be drawn from it for Africa's war on terror, with my current guest, the international relations consultant and president of RTH Consulting, Richard T. Hines. It's Nigeria's President Buhari who set that debate running days after he wrote an opinion piece in which he calls Africa the new frontline of global militancy, saying that extremism has risen while the COVID-19 pandemic distracted people. So, as Afghanistan falls, what then does it mean for the continent? And the international relations consultant, Richard T. Hines, is still with me from the U.S. state of South Carolina. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And I have to say, I think your computer's tilted a bit, so half your head is whacked off at the moment. That's better. We can see you better now. And just continuing with the same theme of Afghanistan and Africa, I guess the big risk, Richard, lies at the propaganda level, how the militant groups will use the Taliban's victory against a superpower in gaining support, in strengthening themselves. I mean, do you think that could have repercussions in, for instance, the Sahel or in Somalia? Maybe even northern Nigeria and Mozambique?
Well, the answer to that is yes, obviously. And so your question, I believe, that you're posing is how do we oppose that? We oppose that by strengthening traditional African culture and African ways and infrastructure and employment and this matter. I don't think radicalism and terrorism is African in its nature. It's this fanaticism is an importation. I was saying that earlier. It's very important. For example, if you had a government in Afghanistan that was truly supported by the people, it wouldn't have collapsed overnight as the Americans withdrew their troops. Clearly, if you had a situation as we have had in northern Nigeria with Boko Haram, the Nigerian army has not collapsed because of it's borne the responsibility of combat essentially alone with some help from America and other Western countries. So you've got to strengthen what's already there. We can't go in and nation build, create something that we want in our image after an American model. It doesn't work.
Absolutely. But isn't there an argument, because we were talking earlier about the way that the Americans left Afghanistan. I
Sure.
mean, isn't there an argument based on that Western countries which are involved militarily in various parts of Africa may change their stance and the way they operate because of what happened in Afghanistan? I mean, do you foresee that type of change? The US has a sort of Africa command, and you've got other countries like, France and so on, with lots of troops in various parts of Africa.
The answer to your question is yes. There's no option. They've got to change. Well, certainly, if we are faced with a militant takeover in an African country, the evacuation could not have been handled in a worse way. I know, Charles, you're interested in American politics. This is going to be a major negative for President Biden when he comes up for re-election and when the Congress comes up for re-election next year. I know Nigeria has an election next year, but the Americans have a congressional election, and this is a big negative because they were, his comment was, well, President Trump was committed to withdrawal of the troops. That's true, but it's hard to believe that Trump would have withdrawn the soldiers before they did the evacuation. Long term, the solution is simple, and that is you've got to find and support governments that have the best interest of their people at heart. not corruption, not immediate gain. And you've got to support the development of infrastructure, which is the subject of our discussion, President Buhari's article, and how it affects the future of terrorism in Africa, or how it can combat terrorism in Africa. And he says to do it through infrastructure development, the Western powers should support this infrastructure. And I agree with President Buhari. It's an article that should be read by all policymakers in Washington, London, Paris, Berlin. They need to take heed, so we don't have another Afghanistan, so we don't give more oxygen to these terrorist movements.
Let me just pick up just briefly a point you made. I mean, Nigeria's presidential election is going to be in 2023, but of course there are governorship elections that will be coming up between sort of November and also into next year. So broadly speaking, you're actually right. But let me take up the other thing that you said, which is about the impact of all this on American politics, because you are, of course, Republican, and so no surprises that you're not entirely in bed with the Democratic president. But I mean, the fact, of course, is that the defense of the Democrats is that they were simply doing that. The person who started this and who failed to negotiate properly was Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump negotiated with the Taliban and completely ignored the Afghan government. And the Afghan government, some have argued, should have been on that negotiating table. And they say that if they were, things probably wouldn't have, they wouldn't have capitulated as quickly as they did.
Well, I would disagree with you on that. I think that negotiating with the people that were obviously going to take over in Afghanistan was exactly the right thing to do. And the fact that we fumbled this evacuation of American citizens and people that work for the government that we set up, it kind of proves the point that it was a puppet government. It had no strength of its own. So I think President Trump was exactly correct to be talking to the Taliban and trying to get reasonable terms and to get them to moderate some of their domestic policies so far as protecting human rights are concerned, and to point out to them the advantages of doing that. But clearly, the people of Afghanistan did not want an American-style democracy. And we miscalculated the whole thing. And we particularly mishandled the evacuation. And I would take my hat off to the president of Uganda and other African countries that are trying to help. It's a humanitarian crisis. And it's laudable that countries would try to help in this crisis.
Well, let's just return to the lessons that can be learned, and you'll be glad to know we've got just 2 more minutes of chat left. But let's return to the lessons,
particularly about American politics. I would say, you have a fascination with American politics. I've always had a fascination with Nigerian politics.
That's why you're there and I'm here. Let's return to the lessons to be learned from Afghanistan, because as we said, President Macron of France talking about removing French troops from Mali so that foreign military presence that African leaders rely on is not necessarily a reliable presence, is it? So the lesson, I suppose, is that when you start relying on foreigners, it's never permanent, and that's what's happened in Afghanistan.
Well, yeah, I think you're exactly correct about this. Now, the requirement, I would say, would be, I made the statement earlier, the Americans withdrew the troops before they withdrew the people, and that was a big mistake. So France shouldn't withdraw its troops from Mali before they aid and support the development of a strong indigenous force, not a puppet government like Afghanistan, but a strong government in Mali that can protect itself. And they should train and equip that armed force before they leave. The idea of running away, this is a terrible idea.
Okay, Richard, I want to thank you very much indeed. You're an absolute star, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. Richard Hines talking to me there from South Carolina. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and around the world. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.